Deanna Wild had just separated from her husband and she was living with her two friends. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do. And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her two friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. And so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock solid case and Virginia and BJ were arrested. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system and she began to get very drowsy. And so while Deanna's in the state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over. BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge. And Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last two pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna, because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing, because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life. Here are the final two pictures that Virginia took of Deanna. Janice Stewart was at home in College Station, Texas, preparing for a wedding she was going to be photographing the following week. Her 34-year-old daughter, named Sunday Rowan, lived a few hours away in San Antonio, and she was planning to go with her to help her take these pictures. As Janice worked, her cell phone kept buzzing. Since sunrise, Sunday had been Snapchatting her photos of her and her husband Matt as they got ready for their hot air balloon ride that day. 18 months earlier, Sunday had bought Matt the tickets as a birthday gift, but the trip kept getting delayed because of bad weather. But on this July morning, the weather had cleared up and the trip was finally happening. At 6:58 that morning, Janice received an image of the balloon's ground crew prepping the wicker basket that would hold her daughter, her son-in-law, and the rest of the other passengers. Around 7:30, Janice received another image. This one was a selfie of Sunday and Matt posing inside of the wicker basket. They were up in the air. There's a beautiful field below them. They're smiling and they're hugging. After that, the messages stopped. 10 minutes later, 85-year-old Buddy Miller was making breakfast in his ranch when he heard two loud explosions. The first one actually rattled his house. When he looked out the window, he saw this massive plume of black smoke on another rancher's land off in the distance. This was a hot air balloon accident. It would turn out the pilot of that hot air balloon was 49-year-old Skip Nichols, and he had elected to fly that day despite a low cloud cover that had grounded the other hot air balloon companies in the area that morning. Also, Skip was on a mixture of prescription and over-the-counter drugs that impaired his ability to fly the balloon safely. After being in the air for 8 miles above the clouds, Skip decided it was time to land, and so he blindly descended through the clouds and he immediately hit a power line. An arc carrying 340,000 volts of electricity cut the balloon's metal support cables like a torch. As soon as the basket began plummeting toward the earth, the fuel lines disconnected from the burners overhead, spraying liquid propane up into the burners, and it arced back down into the wicker basket, immediately engulfing the entire thing in flames. By 10 a.m. that morning, Janice had still not heard from her daughter after that last text she sent, so she turned on the TV, and the first thing she sees is hot air balloon crash in Texas, no survivors. And on the screen, she immediately recognized the smiley face that was on the balloon that had crashed because she recognized it from the images her daughter had sent her. Here are the final pictures taken of Sunday, Matt, and the other 14 people who were on board that balloon. Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 jet airliner entered San Diego airspace. Like all PSA aircraft, Flight 182 had a whimsical black button nose and smiley face painted underneath the cockpit. But the airline was often criticized for being too friendly with their super low airfares, their kind of comic banter that the captains would employ through the intercom to passengers, and their female flight attendants who wore miniskirts and were instructed to make nice with the male passengers. Because the weather was clear, air traffic control directed Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox to switch from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules procedures and to begin their final descent. Visual flight rules refers to pilots using their eyes to guide the plane. It's done when they're flying low, the weather's clear, and they can see the ground. At 8:59 a.m. that morning, as PSA Flight 182 descended down to 4,000 feet, air traffic control advised them of a Cessna, which is a small plane, that was ascending in their direction. Fox responded that they saw the Cessna, and so air traffic control came back and said to maintain visual separation. Maintain visual separation meant that despite ground radar-based controllers who could provide vertical and lateral separation criteria, the burden for maintaining separation fell solely on Captain McFerrin and his crew. In layman's terms, air traffic control was telling them, don't lose sight of the Cessna. Inside the Cessna was a flight instructor named Martin Casey and his student, who was a United States Marine named David Boswell. As this little plane ascended, air traffic control informed them that PSA 182, who was right in front of them and slightly above them, they were on their descent. However, they had the Cessna in sight. But in reality, the Cessna that McFerrin and Fox had seen was the wrong one. At 9:01 that morning, air traffic control got an alarm that PSA 182 and this Cessna are about to collide, but for some reason the air traffic controller did not alert both aircraft, so Casey and Boswell inside of the Cessna just continued to ascend. 1 minute later, at 9:02 a.m., PSA 182 flies directly over the Cessna and strikes them with their nose wheel. The Cessna gets hooked by the wheel and flips upside down and gets trapped underneath the right wing of the jet. Seconds later, the Cessna splits in two. The tail section, containing David Boswell, plummets to the earth like a rag doll. The nose section of the Cessna that contained Martin Casey stayed trapped underneath the right wing for a few seconds before it detonated. At 9:03 a.m., PSA 182 slammed nose first into the ground just outside of downtown San Diego in an area called North Park. The resulting explosion of thousands of gallons of jet fuel sent a shockwave that was registered 2 miles away. The bodies that had not been destroyed in the explosion had gotten trapped up in the trees. All told, 144 people were killed in this accident. 135 were from PSA 182, 2 were from the Cessna, and 7 were just unlucky people that were standing on the ground in North Park. Following a 1-year investigation into the mid-air collision, it was determined that the flight crew of PSA 182 was found to be primarily responsible. The morning of the crash, a San Diego photographer was at a press event and he captured these now 2 infamous photos of PSA 182 seconds before they hit the ground.